Professor Morrisey, welcome to Constitutional Chats. It is an honor to have you with us.
Thanks very much, and I'm glad to be here again.
Well, we would love for you to just make a few opening comments on our topic today, which is avoiding the pitfalls of partisanship. And I know you plan to talk to us about the founders and their views on faction and George Washington's advice he gave our country in his farewell address in 1796. So I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah, partisanship for the founders is more or less synonymous with factionalism. The best definition they give of factionalism is in Federalist 10, which of course is the most famous of all the Federalist papers. And I'll just read it because it's a very precise definition. A faction is a number of citizens, and it could be a number of citizens who are a minority or a majority of the total population. Could be either one. A number of citizens united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, which is adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Now, that's a fairly complicated definition, and I want to unpack it a little bit. When they say, you notice they say it's a number of citizens united and actuated by some common impulse of passion and of interest. That means the unity or the union of a faction consists of an irrational impulse, whether it's passion, not reason, or some sort of self-interest, which is not designed to help the common good. So it's a unity based on unreason. One of the reasons I'm mentioning that is that one of the major themes of the American founders and of people like Lincoln and others who carry on in their pathway is the attempt to make reason rule as much as possible in politics. They don't think it can simply rule, but they want self-government. That self-government means the rule of reason over the passions. It doesn't just mean assertion or passionate attachment to something. So it's a unity based on unreason, and it's unity or interest adverse to the rights of other citizens, in other words, adverse to individual rights, or to the permanent aggregate interests of the community, meaning the whole political community. So it could be adverse to either one. For example, what would be a permanent and aggregate interest of the community? Well, it would be the constitutional union of the United States, wouldn't it? The Federalist is arguing, the Publius and the Federalist is arguing for exactly that. So that's the definition of a faction. It's a particular kind of unity, but it's a unity that injures either individual citizens, or the interests of the community as a whole. Are there any thoughts on that or questions before I go on? Because the next step will be to talk about how George Washington picks that up. The Federalist was published in 1787, and of course, Washington's farewell was in 1796, several years later, but he's still talking about the same things in his farewell address. Any comments on that so far? Did I make it clear what the actual definition of faction is?
Well, I know there's the famous quote from Madison from, gosh, I should know which Federalist paper this is, but is it liberty is to faction what air is to fire?
Yes,
Could you
that's 10th. That's the 10th Federalist. I can explain that. In fact, I can walk you through the argument of the 10th Federalist even before we get to Washington, if you'd like me to do that. I can do that. If you look at the 10th Federalist, you'll see that one of the possibilities, what are you going to do about faction, he says. Faction is endemic. It's part of all politics, but especially the politics of a Republican, small r Republican regime. And one of the things you could try to do, and many people have tried to do it, is to remove the causes of faction. Get rid of faction by removing the causes. One way of getting rid of faction that way, of removing the causes, is to give each citizen the same opinions, the same passions, the same interests. He says that isn't going to happen. First of all, it's impossible. It's just too much, especially in a large place, right? A large country under a Republican regime, there's just going to be too many different kinds of people, too many different interests. Can't do it. There have been attempts to do it. V.I. Lenin tried it in Russia. Joseph Stalin tried it in Russia. Mao tried it. What happens is that in order to do that, you have to kill a lot of people. And that's a violation of the right to life as asserted in the Declaration of Independence. So that's ruled out. The other possibility would, so it's impossible. And what he says is that the protection of the diversity in the faculties of men is the first object of government. Diversity of faculties, not just of property, physical property, but of the faculties of men. That's the first object of government. And what happens, of course, is that when you have diverse faculties, diverse abilities, diverse interests, and so forth, what you're going to get is diversity of physical property, right? Some people are going to be better at making money than others. Some people are going to be better at taking care of their possessions than others. Government, he says, protects the different and unequal faculties of acquiring property. And it also protects the possession of property against theft, for example. So because there's a diversity of kinds of property, there's also going to be a diversity of opinions and a diversity of passions and interests in a political community. And he says that regulating the different property interests forms the principal task of modern legislation. The principal task of modern legislation. And it involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. What does that mean? Well, first of all, regulating different types of property interests forms the principal task of modern legislation. Ancient legislation was not trying to, in an ancient polis, for example, in Sparta, in early Rome, the idea was not to regulate property interests. The idea was to regulate the passions themselves, to set up laws that would militate against the passions that cause political factionalism. You see the distinction? One type of legislation is within a polis. It's a small place. It's a small community. You really can, in a small community, attempt to regulate the passions themselves by punishing people who step out of line and trying to educate them to get rid of their passions, or at least moderate their passions. In a big modern state, there's not that kind of detail. Government can't reach down as easily to each citizen. And so they have to regulate property, different property interests, rather than the passions of the people who own the property. And also in a republic, particularly, if the people are governing themselves, that means that spirit of party and faction, which is inevitable, especially in republics, is going to be part of the necessary operations of government. See what he's saying? So the problem, of course, is what? In law, the party to the case cannot be the judge. That is, the party of the case cannot be the judge. You can't, if I'm accused of a crime, I can't be a judge in my own case, right? But in a republic, one of the judges is bound to be a citizen, right? Bound to be a judge, see, because we're all involved. See that? So that is an impossibility. You know, that's a dead end. That whole way of trying to remove the causes of faction is a dead end. Now, the second way to do it, and this speaks to the point that you're making, Kathy. Second way would be try to remove faction, would be to destroy liberty. And that's where he says, liberty is to faction what fire is to air. The problem is that liberty, he says, is essential to political life. What does he mean by that? In Aristotle defines politics not as one-way rule, dictatorial rule, the rule of a parent over a child, a young child, for example, or the rule of a master over a slave. That's not political rule. In a household, the true political rule is the reciprocal rule of husband and wife. That is to say, ruling and being ruled, give and take, 35 years of happy marriage, that kind of thing. And that's political rule, ruling and being ruled. So if you destroy that, if you destroy liberty, you're going to destroy the basis of political life. You're going to destroy the basis of self-government. So both of those things are out. And of course, the Federalist goes on to talk about how actually to address faction, and that's the familiar part of the Federalist, right? The institutional safeguards, separation and balance of power, the extension of the American Republic over a large territory so that the various diverse factions can compete with one another and kind of cancel each other out when they want to do something, when one of them wants to do something wrong. So that's where your Federalist comes in.
Well, thank you. And we'll let you get on to George Washington's farewell address.
Okay.
That's
yes.
an important part of this.
Washington picks right up on this. It's 8 years later, right? Or 9 years later. He says, look at this. He says, passions agitated in every direction are liable to mislead. Passions, agitated passions. That's against the rule of reason. That's exactly the point that Publius had made several years earlier. A national political union that under the Constitution, he says, is threatened by those who would manipulate passions to undermine the union. Again, that's right out of the Federalist, right out of the Federalist. Quote, he says, first of all, how does he address this question? First of all, he says that the American people are fundamentally united on certain issues. He says, with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. That is to say, there's no rational contradiction among your religious your religious principles, your habits, and your political principles. You furthermore, so there's no rational contradiction there. You have the chance of governing yourself reasonably on that basis. The other thing he says is that you also have an interest, a shared interest in maintaining the union. In other words, there's no contradiction with your fundamental interests. Why is it rationally useful to have a union? First of all, the union is a vast free trade zone. It's an area where you can have commerce without tariffs, internal tariffs. So New York can trade with New Jersey and the other states in the union without any tariffs. So it's to your commercial benefit to keep the union. It's in your self-interest that way. It's also good for self-defense. Obviously, a bigger country is going to be able to raise more troops and to buy more weapons to defend itself than a small country. So the union is good for you that way. And finally, you have shared resources. He talks about the different things that exist in different parts of the country. Timber in the South, and the pine forests of the South, various forms of mining that go on in the North. All those things are better if they're pooled in one national market. So he also, so those are that's why the union does not contradict itself in terms of interest, right? And he also says, speaking again on the Madisonian point about liberty, says the union is the main prop of your liberty because the Constitution provides a legal framework for the political union of the United States. And what does he mean by that? Why is that rational? Because that means the rule of law can prevail. The rule of law under the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, right, is ruled by consent of the governed. So that's reasonable. It can be amended, but until such time as it is amended, it should be obeyed, he says. It should be obeyed. Don't allow your passions of the moment to overrule your attachment to the thing that allows you to have free commerce, effective national defense, and abundant national resources. To refuse to obey the Constitution is to do what? It's to give faction, he says, an artificial and extraordinary force, replacing the delegated will of the nation, that is the consent of the governed, with the will of a party. Now, he then goes on, uses a very interesting phrase. He says, the spirit of party, the spirit, he talks about the spirit of party. Why does he say that? Well, what he's doing, he's making an allusion to something that everybody in the 18th century in the United States who had any study of politics behind him knew very well. The famous political philosopher, French political philosopher from the early part of the 18th century, Montesquieu, wrote a famous book, The Spirit of the Laws, from which the founders drew many of the ideas for the Constitution. The spirit of the laws is the spirit of reason, right? It's the spirit of ruling and being ruled in turn. It's the spirit of reciprocity. It's the spirit of a republican government under constitutional law. The spirit of party is intended, that phrase is intended to contrast with that Montesquieu phrase. In our case, the Constitution is what provides the laws, is the basic set of laws, and the spirit of the Constitution is the rational deliberation that you get when you read the Federalist Papers. Now, the spirit of party, he says, resulting in faction is, quote, inseparable from our nature, having its roots in the strongest passions of the human mind. In other words, you're not going to get rid of partisanship or factionalism because human beings themselves are impassioned, right? They're not unfailingly ruled by reason. So you're not going to get rid of faction, he says, again, very Madisonian type of point, right? Same kind of point they made in the Federalists. And that's especially true, he says, in popular governments, meaning republics. Res publica means the public thing, doesn't it? So anything that exacerbates passion, a faction. What does a faction do? What do factions want? They want revenge against some other faction, don't they? Right? It's like the Hatfields and the McCoys, an Appalachian feud. They want to get back at those people who did something they don't like. And you see places in the world where these factions date back centuries in some cases. Religious factions, for example, very often in the Middle East, go back for many, many centuries. It exacerbates the spirit of revenge, and that yields crimes. And then when you get a spirit of lawlessness that comes after the spirit of faction, the spirit of lawlessness, then what happens is people want what? They want a strongman government. They want to be protected against these violent factions. And so they turn not to republicanism, but to despotism. A good example of that would be Saddam Hussein in Iraq, right? The Iraqis had a republican form of government in the 1950s. It wasn't working. The three major factions in that country were at each other's throats. So they called for Saddam Hussein to come in, and they get decades of tyranny. And that's what he wants to avoid. So, and he says that even if that doesn't happen, he says, even if that doesn't happen, even if factionalism does not result in despotism. Oh, the example of that right before him, of course, in the 1790s is France, isn't it? The Republican faction wants revenge against the aristocratic and monarchic faction. The monarchic and aristocratic faction wants revenge against the Republicans. Who comes in? Napoleon Bonaparte. And you get despotism for the next 15 years and a world war, because he tries to conquer Europe. But even without that, he says that faction agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. It kindles the spirit of animosity of one part against another. It foments riot and insurrection. Does that sound familiar in the United States today? Sure does, right? And it opens the door, he says, to, quote, foreign influence and corruption, subjecting our popular will to that of foreigners. Now, he's thinking of what? Again, the 1790s, when the French ambassador, Republican French ambassador Edmond Genet came over and tried to stir up Americans to intervene in the war that the French were fighting against the monarchists in Europe. But do we have foreign influence in the United States today that is trying to exploit factional divisions? We sure do. And I don't need to name all the countries that are trying to do that, but we all know who they are. So that's his take on factionalism. And you can see from both of those documents, both Federalist 10 and the farewell address, that they understand faction to be the rule of unreason, lawless rule of unreason by either a majority or a minority in the political community that's out to overturn the Republican regime, that is to say, the will of the people. Questions, comments, criticisms?
That's great. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful review of George Washington's farewell address. And it is amazing how prescient George Washington was, and the things that he warned us against. And, you know, just his vision just never ceases to amaze me. And I'm going to turn it over to Jewel and Joran in just a minute. But as I mentioned at the top of the program, Tova couldn't be with us, and she had sent a question she was really hoping that we could get answered today. And she was just wondering, how did the party system develop in America, and what were the major parties at the beginning of the country?
Major parties at the beginning of the country were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists centered on President John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton, of course, was one of the key players there. And then the Democratic Republicans centered around Thomas Jefferson, to a lesser extent, but still James Madison, and Aaron Burr, who eventually killed Hamilton, was a Democratic Republican. And that was, in my opinion, that partisan divide was based on a serious misunderstanding. The Democrat Jefferson, who wanted a minimal sort of federal government, and thought that democracy depended on a very minimal form of federal government, strongly suspected, incorrectly, that John Adams was somehow a monarchist, or that Hamilton was a monarchist, because they wanted a strong presidency. And they even, some of the more radical Democratic Republicans even suspected George Washington of this, which again was absurd. But you can see how in our own system right today, people will suspect people and imagine conspiracies that aren't really there, and project bad motives to people who simply disagree with them about something that is really a difference in degree rather than in kind. So that was the first party system. The first party system was the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists withered away. They lost. Jefferson and Madison provided 16 straight years of Democratic Republican presidents. Then followed by Monroe, who was another one of their allies in Virginia. He was a Democratic Republican. And so by the time, for many years, there really wasn't a party system. It declined. There were factions within the Democratic Republican Party, however, but there wasn't a formal party system. Then what happens is that some of the financial devices that Hamilton liked, such as the National Bank and other things, another thing that he liked was what they called improvements, meaning federally funded projects like road systems, which America, of course, in those days could use a few roads, right? It was a very rugged terrain, and you can't do everything by river and ocean. So they wanted some national support for that. There was a group that wanted to revive some of Hamilton's ideas, and that was the Whig Party. The Whig Party did elect some presidents, But it too faded out in the 1850s, because by then what you had, of course, was the exacerbation of this very serious partisan divide, a genuine factional partisan divide between the slaveholding states and the free states, or the relatively free states. They had a few slaves, but not many. And that led to the formation of the Republican Party. The Republican Party's name was intended to talk about the fact that to obliquely talk about the fact that the southern states weren't fully Republican, small r Republican, because they had slaves, which meant that they had a kind of aristocracy or oligarchy governing them, and they weren't true republics in the American sense. That, by the way, was something that James Madison admitted in the founding generation, but they hoped to ameliorate it over time, and they never did. So I hope that answers Tova's question. I'm sure she'll let us know if I failed.
That is fascinating. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Jewel and Jorn, because I know they've got a lot of questions as well.
Gentlemen.
All right. Thank you for so much information. I hope our listeners have watched some of the series before, because much of what you said is enriched by things we have heard about. What you said added a lot to our discussions on anarchy, on monarchy, on communism, because it ends up coming back to the founders' true mission of trying to find this American experiment of the best government to rule on earth, or the best government for man to create. And to hear those themes again kind of come together in this discussion, I wasn't sure how it was going to all synthesize today, and it really has come together. And a question, I guess, number one would be, George Washington said, okay, from what you said, I think you said it was him. He said that our people generally have the same ideas, based suppositions on many things. We have a similar faith. We have a similar heritage. There's generally European. So do you think that the people that as the country, well, let me go back. So he said our people had a similar reason. And then you had said that the founders believed that reason had to subjugate the passions in a democratic republic in order to have freedom. Then the next step would be, okay, as time went on, we had the separation of church and state become almost a de facto enshrined, even though it's not really in the founding documents. It became, particularly in the last century, almost taken as if it's a law somewhere. And it seems as if what Washington said stops being true. There is no principle that the American people or America, even as a government, support a superordinate principle than that America is heading towards, that there is a God endowed us with these inalienable rights. Whether you want to make the argument of the deist founders or whatever argument you try to make, the concept of the inalienable rights from natural law is still embedded in our founding documents. So as that was stripped away, it was Washington's, and they had to deal with their own issue with factions. But if we got to a point where our factions are going to have such a deep divide that if we can't agree on this founding principle of that, where our rights come from, our factions are destined to tear us apart.
That's a possibility. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. What has happened is that the natural rights principles, the notion of unalienable rights, the laws of nature and of nature's God, and so forth, were attacked starting in the late 19th century in the United States by people who believed that rights do not derive from nature and from God, right? The laws of nature and of nature's God, but rather from the course of history. This is the philosopher who talked about this was Hegel, but there were many others who followed in his line in the 19th century, including the American progressives. What they thought was that history was going to make us evolve in a higher and higher direction and gradually bring us to a point where we really didn't need the Constitution anymore. because the Constitution was what Woodrow Wilson, one of the leading progressives, called a horse and buggy document. It was based on Newtonian physics, not Darwinian evolutionism. But Darwinian evolutionism, which is history, right? It's nature evolving over time. It's history. It's natural history. That is a different source of right than the natural rights foundation of the Constitution. And it allows you to have what Wilson calls the elastic or living Constitution, which will also evolve over time. See, so that puts a divide between the progressives and people like Lincoln, who came a generation or two before the progressives. There were fewer and fewer people who adhered to the principles of the Declaration, the natural rights principles of the Declaration. More and more people who talk about historical rights, which is why you hear phrases like, "You don't want to be on the wrong side of history." Well, maybe you do want to be on the wrong side of history. Maybe if history is going in a bad direction, you want to drop out of it or resist it in some way, right? But they are assuming optimistically that history is an onward and upwards saga. Another thing that happened, and this, by the way, speaks directly to our current situation. We're talking about school shootings, right, in the United States. And people are saying, well, why is this? Is it because people have guns? Well, maybe not, though, because Americans have always been fully armed. And in fact, if they weren't, they wouldn't have had a successful war of independence, right? You could say that the guns are more powerful nowadays. That's true. But still, there weren't these massive shootings where somebody took a shotgun or a rifle or some other relatively now primitive form of weapon and attacked. Why is that? The answer is that, in my opinion, and this is just a hypothesis, I can't prove anything, it's just something I'm putting out there to consider, is that in the 1960s, progressivism itself was attacked. And it was attacked by, not on the right, but on the left. It was attacked by the new left, as they called themselves. The new left wasn't the old left. The old left, the progressive left, was still a form of rationalism, wasn't it? They were saying that there were laws of historical progress that are rationally discernible. We can predict rationally which way history is going to go. And that's why we're on the right side and those people who are opposing us are on the wrong side. That's rationalism. And it led to a form of rationalism in government, right? It led to a large fourth branch of government, namely a bureaucracy, which claims to have a science of administration, a rational form of government that doesn't need elections to run it. See, but that's still rationalism. What happened in the 60s was the new left, spurred primarily by opposition to the Vietnam War, which was overseen by bureaucrats in the Pentagon, wasn't it? They predicted, I'll give you an example. When I was 13 years old, 13 years, yeah, I think 13 years old, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed, which increased the amount of troops in Vietnam. The Pentagon guys in those days says, if we get more money and more troops, we're going to be done with that war in a year and a half. And that is a rational prediction based on the metrics that we have at our disposal. They were mistaken. Then after that, they said, well, okay, we miscalculated, but a couple of years, 1 or 2 years more, give us more money, more troops, we'll get it done. Didn't happen. War was still going on. So and that was under the Johnson administration. That was under progressives, New Dealers, right? The new left says, no, rationalism isn't working. Reason isn't working. What we need is authenticity. What we need is passion in politics. And our passion is for what? For peace, social justice, various things that they talk about from that day to this. The problem is that when you valorize passion, where does it stop? It can end in a murderous spree, right? It can unleash people from the rule of law. It can unleash people from at least attempting to govern themselves rationally. And as a result, you're going to get a spirit of lawlessness. Who predicted this? Well, you just heard George Washington, right? Abraham Lincoln, in his speech as a very young man, he did a speech to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. He talked about the spirit of misrule, of defying the rule of law, mob violence. He talked about these mob violent activities and school shootings and other things are, in my opinion, made much more likely by the devalorization of reason and the valorization of passion. Passion is not benign necessarily. We learn this from the Apostle Paul, among other people, but you don't have to even go to the Bible. All you have to do is look around you and you can see.
Absolutely a fascinating answer there. Thank you so much. Wasn't expecting so much of an answer. That was really awesome. And it leads me to the next question, which is that, yeah, it's as if that at some point reason and faith were separated or made at odds, and some chose reason as if that there was no way to have both. And then reason turned in on itself and they denied reason. And that's almost where we are now, where we have a denial of rationalism. And there is a faction, as we talked about faction, there's a faction that is a large, loud faction that is denying rationalism or any type of objective truth, objective reality, even in a rational sense. And that faction has gained power over institutions, I think, because they have a deep understanding, I guess, of how institutions work, because they are totally worldly and they're able to take them over, whether they run them well or efficiently or not. They're somehow able to gain power over them. And then we see it all around us. So as we're having this discussion and we talked about what the founders saw in this faction issue, we do have the faction, as you said, like, I guess we could call it the new left, where it's completely destructive. But there are many in still the old left camp. And I wonder, as we're having this faction discussion, we still have all of the factional divides and speaking to them. But how would you be able to try to make them understand, hey, maybe our differences are more of the differences between people of slightly different factions, and they're less than the divide between you and those who are denying reason totally? Because we kind of have, when we do have these discussions, kind of get the blank stare, and they kind of think, oh no, they really don't think that. They really don't think the things that you just said. The average person who may lean that way, who may lean left, will say, no, people in my party really don't think that.
Well, all they have to do is read the books, right? If you read Angela Davis, if you read Abby Hoffman, if you read those guys from the New Left, you'll see that they do mean that. Now, there is a certain rationalism behind some of them, which is that they're manipulating passions, the way George Washington suggests. By the way, why is George Washington prescient? It's not because he foresees the future, it's because he knows human nature. And so certain conditions will print out, so to speak, with certain effects, no matter what, because human nature doesn't progress. It really doesn't. It stays pretty much the same, no matter what. And as to your point about faith and reason, the split between faith and reason, I wanted to pick up on that too. If you recall, I'm sure you're very familiar with the beginning of the Gospel of John, right? In the beginning is the Word. What is that word in Greek? It's logos. What does logos mean? It means speech or word. It also means reason. So that means that God is reasonable. It's so for them, there's no, for the New Testament apostles, there's no necessary distinction between faith and reason. That your faith in God is actually an endorsement of a reasonable being who rules. See? So now you were asking, getting back to your question, I think I remember it, but in case I don't, remind me of it. I'm an elderly gentleman, as you can plainly see, and my short-term memory is very poor. You're trying to say, okay, what do you say to people who deny this, right? And the answer is, well, it depends on the person, right? Some people are open to a sort of quiet, rational discussion. Some people just deny it. I'm sorry to say that really what happens in such circumstances is that reality has to beat them over the heads. That the effects of faction are so virulent that sometimes it really does cause for example, in the 1850s. That's a perfect example. The factions were not reconciled, and it ended up in the bloodiest war in American history by far. More people died in that war than World War I, World War II, and Korea combined. More Americans did. So there are going to be times, I am not the Pollyanna-ish type, right? I am very, I smile, but I do not look at this situation with any great optimism. I think that really what it comes down to in these circumstances is either the situation becomes so dire internally that people coalesce finally and kind of defeat the extremists, or another possibility is that you get something like a unifying event that comes exogenously, a depression, a war that unites the people, something like that.
Thank you very much for your honesty, though, in your answer. And again, for all information, I know Jordan has some questions.
So somehow we got to talking about factionalism some months ago, and our guest was, we had a nice conversation, but we really came down to sort of that back in, like the Thomas Jefferson era, although they disagreed, there was this understanding that all Americans were for the common good of men. And then we kind of came to that idea might be what has been lost and created such a heavier version of factionalism, because it almost turned into the good for me, like almost a supreme selfishness in deciding which direction the country should go. So I just wanted to know if you could speak on that a little bit, and then maybe get into how to get out of that hole.
Well, as I say, I'm not optimistic about getting out of the hole, so I'm going to stick to that. It's not a prediction. I'll tell you, I don't know if we'll have the time. I'll tell you how I cured myself of political prediction, but I won't get into that right now. So anyway, here's the thing. If you're going to have a united country, you need what is called a regime, right? And the question is, okay, what is that? What's a regime? And the answer is right in Aristotle's Politics. A regime has 4 components to it. First, and this is good for you to know, no matter what organization you get involved with, a church, a business, a country, any kind of organization, you can learn this and you'll be able to organize your thoughts about it very quickly. I had a former student who had never been to Hong Kong. The Wall Street Journal sent her to Hong Kong. She used this Aristotelian regime theory that she learned from me in college to start to get an understanding of Hong Kong. Well, what is it? First of all, you want to know who rules, who's in charge. Is it one? Is it few? Is it many? Is it good or is it bad? You could have the good rule of the one, like a wise monarch, someone like King Solomon. You could have the bad rule of the one, Ahab, someone like that, Stalin. You could have a good rule of the one. A good rule of the one would be a genuine aristocracy of people who are truly virtuous. Aristotle says that's a very rare regime. Or you can have a bad rule of the one, people who are simply rich and who are out to squeeze more money out of the poor. You could also have a bad rule of the many, which is a democracy, right? Democracy is a bad rule where the many want to squeeze the rich. You can also finally, you can have a good rule of the many, a republic, which is a balance of those two factions. A balance that they're both self-interested, but what you say is, okay, you rich guys get one branch of the legislature, you many but poorer people get the other branch, and no law can pass that you don't agree on. That's a mixed regime. See, now that's an institutional, and that's a little bit like what the founders had, isn't it? And it does generate something that is roughly like the common good. The other dimensions to the regime, not just who rules, but also, as I just implied, the institutional structures by which the ruling offices, how they're arranged, separation and balance of powers, representative government, that kind of thing. And then the way of life, that's what Washington is talking about to some extent, the way of life of the people. If you have certain kinds of rulers and certain kinds of institutions, you're going to be channeled along certain pathways of living. So if it's a commercial republic, many people are going to go into business. If it's a military republic like ancient Rome, the heroes are going to be warriors, right? Different types of ways of life. And finally, the purposes of government under the founding are securing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so that being said, the challenge is that the people who are factionalizing now have rejected the American regime. See, that's why I went into that long dissertation about a regime. See, that's the payoff. You thought I was going nowhere, but in fact, I was going somewhere. And the somewhere is that if you don't understand the regime and you don't study the roots of the American regime from the writings of the people who made it, then you're not going to, which is what constituting America does, right? That's the purpose of it. Then you won't know what you're missing. And you can very easily wander off that path into pretty dangerous territory, although it looks like good territory. I don't know if that answered your question, John.
Yeah, that definitely answered it. I would ask you many more, but we have to get to some audience questions before our time's out.
I see 10 of them.
Yeah.
Well, and thank you, Jill and Jorn. Those were great questions and really added a lot to the discussion. Professor Morrisey, Robert Zimmerman writes, seems that partisanship is passionate today, bullying or canceling others. And I apologize if my glasses are a little off today. I'm trying to read it best I can. Even and maybe more so in their own parties. Use of the media by the passionate is no help. And then he goes on to clarify, let's see, it seems like he had a follow-up. He said, guess my question is, how can these congressmen who are up for re-election every 2 years stand up to these bullies and survive the controlled media to get re-elected?
Well, they have to grow a spine, right? In other words, yeah, the fact of the matter is that most of these congressmen do get reelected. You know, despite all the noise, right? They can form consistent long-term policies, even as House of Representative guys who have only 2 years per term. Most of them survive repeated elections, partly because of the way the districts are arranged. But so they don't have any excuse. I don't think they have any excuse at all. As far as the media are concerned, one of the problems with the social media is that it's anonymous. People invent screen names. And so instead of saying Jorna and Jewel Gilbert, it says, you know, some imaginary name. You don't see a real picture of the people. Now, when they are on here, we can see them and they are taking responsibility for what they say, right? Same thing with me and with you and everybody who's talking on this podcast. We take responsibility. But if you have anonymous posts on the internet, you can say any outrageous thing that comes into your mind. You don't really know who you're talking to. You could be easily talking to some troll who's just out for giggles, right? Or you could be talking to a foreign agent. You don't know what you're talking, who or what you're talking to. And that does not help rational discourse, right? Because there's no responsibility. And notice, it's a moral virtue, responsibility, that backs up reason, the use of reason.
Well, thank you. It's so true. Mary Bowler asks, or has a statement and then a question. Mary says, I see both parties as being passionate and unreasonable. I see the need for various parties developing. And then she goes on and says, thank you, good and reasonable participants and facilitators, which is nice. Thank you, Mary. She said, I wish we had term limits. And so and I think Mary had also asked, I thought I saw one more statement in here, wondering if there's really any sort of middle anymore, or if we're just controlled by the far ends of the spectrum on both sides.
Yeah, one of the strategies of extremists, right, is to make political life repugnant to normal people. If you're just an ordinary person who'd like to serve on a school board or a library board, the people who are extremists will rip into you and make it undesirable for you to serve. That's a strategy. That's a strategy for using passion. We had an example of that right here in my hometown very recently, which is that one of the library board members had a policy that some of the others didn't like. They had a debate about it, but people on both sides of the issue turned up. They kind of did a flash mob scenario where both of them turned up. And there was one woman in particular who just gave out with the most virulent, foul-mouthed denunciation of this guy. And the whole purpose of it was not because it was an honest expression of passion, but simply to make it so unpleasant for people who are not on her side to govern that people will just abandon local government altogether. And that's a strategy, and it's a strategy that was originated on the left, but the right can do the same thing if they so choose. They can, very often they learn bad habits from the left.
Well, thank you. And we have with us today in our audience Kyle Jenks, who is a professional interpreter of James Madison.
Wow.
And Kyle had an interesting statement to add to our discussion. Kyle says, wouldn't Madison's statement, from advice to my country, be helpful in shaping this discussion to a fruitful end? Federalist number 55, a degree of depravity in mankind requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust. So there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form.
Yes, it does. And the question we've been wrestling with, right, is are those qualities manifesting themselves sufficiently at this present time? And the answer so far is no, but as Madison points out, human nature is permanent. So therefore there are the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln said as well. So that's why it's really fruitless to try to predict. All you can do is stand on the ground that is the American founding.
Well, thank you, Professor Morrisey. And maybe that is a good place for us to end up, is invoking the better angels of our nature, despite, our maybe a little lack of optimism. Maybe there's still some hope. And we just are so grateful to have you today and for all of your thoughts and your wisdom. And Jewel and Jorn, thank you so much to all you added to the discussion. And we want to thank our audience for all of your great comments and questions. And Jewel and Jorn, is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
So thanks for a great show and all those insights. And this was an interesting one where so many of the themes we've talked about were brought up at once.
Yeah, I just really appreciate your ability to share your knowledge with us. So,
and happy birthday, Jacob.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I think Jacob wanted to remind us of something real quick.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So if anyone would like to listen to this podcast later or any of our other podcasts, you can find all of them, the full list, on our website, just on the front page of our website in the archives, and just right underneath where you signed up today. You can also search for Constitutional Chats on any of the major streaming platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and even our Facebook page. So please check that out.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being with us. And thank you again, Professor Morrisey. Just, it's always so wonderful to have you and a real honor to have you. So thank you for being with us.
Yes,
Thank you.
Also, if you would like to sign up for next week, we've got the link in the Q&A. Jeanette had asked for the link, and the link is right there. So feel free to sign up for next week as well.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, thank you for being with us.
Okay. So
Bye.
long.